Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to talk about slavery as an institution. So it's kind of a two-part video. The next one will focus on kind of the slave experience. This one we're talking about it as a Southern institution and kind of somewhat to a degree from the perspective of the slave owners. So what we have to understand about slavery is that it's a fundamental and inherent contradiction. So look at these pictures. So there's a couple things going on. One, it's the plantation owners showing off their wealth, basically using African Americans as set pieces for their photographs, saying, look, here's a picture of my kid. Oh, and there's a piece of furniture who I'm showing off. That's my slave. So you're saying, oh, look, I'm wealthy enough to have a slave that her whole existence is to take care of my child. So she is a fixture in the picture, not a person to these slave owners. But on the second part of this, she is, even though she's a slave, she is someone these owners trust enough with the life of their child. So you got to understand the weirdness that's going on here. She's property, another person owns her, she has no freedom of her own, but they're entrusting arguably their most precious possession, their children, with her. Now, while this is going on, while this weirdness is happening in the house, so in the big plantation house, outside on the plantation itself, this is happening. So severe, brutal beatings. So it could be the smallest slight to the worst kind of affront, but the attacks and the beatings were brutal. And this is just physical beatings. Then you have psychological trauma, sexual trauma, all these kinds of things getting mixed up in this very screwed up system. This is why they call it the peculiar institution, because many people around the world were like, this is weird, this is kind of screwed up. But in the South, they're like, well, you don't understand why we have to do this. So the slave owners are kind of trying to justify what they're doing and explain, oh, this is necessary for a variety of reasons. Now, the slave owner's biggest fear is slave revolt. So if you own a plantation, you basically wake up in the morning worrying if your slaves are going to revolt and kill you, and you're going to bed at night worrying that your slaves are going to kill you. So picture this. It's you, your family, you're a slave owner, it's you and your family living on this plantation. There's maybe anywhere from 5 to 10 white family members living on that plantation. That same plantation might have anywhere from 10 to 50 to 100 slaves, depending how big the plantation is. So the odds that the slave owners are going to be able to win against a revolt of slaves is always very slim. And your plantation is probably, 50, 100, 200, 300 acres, depending how big it is. The neighbor might be 20, 30, 40 minutes, an hour away. So if anything goes wrong, it's your head. So this image is of the Haitian Revolution, kind of the biggest slave revolt in history, where the slaves on the island of Haiti revolted, overthrew the French, and basically set up their own independent government. And this was the worst case scenario for many American slave owners. They saw this as a real possibility, so they kind of resorted to this extreme violence to make sure the slaves were always kind of cowed into submissive status. Kind of this instill enough fear of causing a revolt, and maybe that revolt won't happen. But you got to understand, these slave owners are living in perpetual fear. You think it's kind of ironic. They're the masters. They're the ones that own other people. They're the ones with the power. But they're also kind of trapped by this same system. They're living in this perpetual state of fear of where they know they're doing terrible things to other people. And they know those other people don't like what's being done to them. But they keep doing it just because. Thomas Jefferson, whenever he was talking about slavery, we all know Jefferson was a slave owner. He had his issues. But he describes slavery as having a wolf by the ears. So you got a wolf facing you, you're holding it by the ears. You don't want to be holding that wolf because it's snarling, trying to bite your face off. But if you let go of that wolf, it will bite your face off. And the wolf is slavery. So you don't want to hold on to it, but you don't want to let it go. And that's how many slave owners felt. And they'll justify it in a whole slew of different ways, which we'll talk about. But you got to understand this is kind of this perpetual fear. So the slaves are afraid of reprisals, physical, sexual, psychological violence. But the masters are living in kind of their self-inflicted fear of, will my slaves revolt and try to kill me? So the whole Southern society is a society based upon fear. And that's not a very stable world. So you have different social movements, abolition, anti-slavery, which we'll talk about in another video, but for the most part, most Southerners don't give this any stock. And if you do try to do this kind of stuff in the South, you're pretty much going to get run out of the South. So we have several attempted slave revolts in the United States, and one kind of generally successful one, although it backfires on the slaves because they weren't successful enough. So you have Gabriel Prosper's rebellion in 1800. It gets kind of foiled before it ever really takes off. You have Denmark Vesey's rebellion, very similar situation. But you see this is happening every decade or two, someone's trying to revolt because there's a clear desire for these slaves not to be slaves. These are people, they don't want to be slaves. Most successful is Nat Turner's rebellion. And basically, when Nat Turner and his fellow slaves revolted, they killed every white person they could find, man, woman, and child included. So the violence that was inflicted upon them, they inflicted upon their aggressors. So this kind of has a counter effect on the slaves because all across the United States, not just in the area of Virginia where Nat Turner's rebellion happened, but all across the United States, slaves were punished for this rebellion. If you had a troublesome slave on your plantation, many slave owners, when they heard about Nat Turner's and they knew their slaves had heard about it, they would beat or kill that troublemaking slave as an example of, if you think of doing this, this is what's going to happen. So while a few dozen white people died in Nat Turner's rebellion, far more African Americans all across the South die as a result. So the rebellions, well, the impetus is understandable, why they want to rebel, but they're never successful enough to really have the desired effect. So now we're going to look a little bit about how slave owners defend the institution of slavery. Now, starting this off, I'm not saying any of these are good defenses or logical or anything else. I'm just saying this is what, at the time, they were saying, what slave owners said about the institution of slavery. First and foremost, slaves are happy. They want to be doing this work. They said if African Americans weren't given jobs as slaves or forced to work as slaves, they wouldn't. They are lazy, they're not motivated, it's just not great. And the biggest sign of their happiness was they're like, look, the slaves are singing. Clearly they must be happy. Now the songs they're singing are called slave hymns, and what they're singing about is how to escape often, or how to endure. So one of the most famous songs is Follow the Drinking Gourd. Now the drinking gourd relates to the Big Dipper. And at the tip of the handle of the Big Dipper is the North Star. So when they're singing Follow the Drinking Gourd, they're not saying go get a drink of water. They're saying at night, when the sky is clear, you can look up, find the Big Dipper, follow the North Star, and get the hell out of slavery. So it's not exactly a song about being happy in their situation. So you see this portrayed in movies all the way up into the early 1900s, 1950, 1960. So you have this African American woman playing what's called an Aunt Jemima kind of character, this happy-go-lucky slave who's just, one of the family, always happy, always has, spring in her step, always willing to help out, always willing to participate. This is Gone with the Wind, one of the biggest movies, ever, but even at the time, it was massive. And it portrayed slaves as kind of this happiness. So you see this idea of slaves being happy during slavery, but then you see it for decades afterwards. Even after the Civil War and the South lost, they're still portrayed as this kind of happiness. We'll talk more about why the Civil War doesn't kill this permanently and why the Southern kind of point of view comes out on top. But nonetheless, slaves are happy was one of the biggest defenses of the institution. Now, another example of kind of slaves being happy is, if you've ever seen Django Unchained, Samuel L. Jackson's character plays what's considered an Uncle Tom. So it's a black man who has received power from his white masters, basically over the other slaves. So he can be, overseeing other slaves. He can have a more prestigious job in the house, whatever it might be. But basically, he is a whitewashed slave. So he acts like a white guy, dresses like a white guy, talks like a white guy, but at the end of the day, he's still a slave. But this is someone that the slave owners can point to as, look, this slave is a slave, but he's clearly happy, he has a good life. They kind of neglect everything else that's happening on the plantation. They point to this one example. It's like you're looking at the exception, not the rule. Now, whether or not he was happy or if he was just taking advantage of a bad situation, we don't know. So we don't have diaries from a lot of these men and women. Without their actual thoughts, we can only make suppositions. But odds are he wasn't too happy with being a slave, but he was making the best of a bad situation. The Bible is another huge defense of slavery. Many slave owners argued there is slavery in the Bible, therefore it is biblically sound to own slaves. But they go further, and they say the Bible story, Cain and Abel, and the fight and how one brother kills the other to try to seize his inheritance and all this kinds of stuff. But Cain is cursed by God in the Bible, and all of Cain's descendants are cursed to serve all of Abel's descendants. So this is an interesting thing. Many white Southerners cherry-picked this one story out and said, oh, look, there's a group of people that is marked by God to be slaves of another group of people. And in these white Southerners' minds, being black, having black skin, is the mark. That's what determines from God whether or not you should be a slave. Now, that was not the interpretation for a long time. By the time we get to the 1800s, getting closer to 1850, 1860 in the Civil War, this idea becomes more and more prominent. And they force their slaves to go to church to listen to these stories and to listen to this kind of narrative. However, the slaves often picked up on a different story. They liked Moses and Moses setting all the Israelites free in Egypt. So while the slave owners were trying to say, oh, listen to these Bible stories, slavery is good, God ordains it, the slaves are like, we'll just pick this other one that says God's going to set us free. He's going to send us a Moses to save us. So this is why people like Harriet Tubman get the nickname Moses, or Abraham Lincoln get the nickname Moses, because this is a story that slaves latch onto. They're forced into Christianity, forced to adopt these ideas and attend these church services. So they latch onto the stories that benefit them. A third defense is to civilize the slave, to take them out of Africa, this barbaric state, which is kind of a fallacy because there were civilizations. That's where we got the first slaves from. The first Europeans arrived, interacted with massive African civilizations to get the first slaves. But nonetheless, white Southerners say, oh, we're making them American, we're introducing them to God and to Christianity, we're teaching them proper agriculture and ways of life, we're giving them purpose, we're civilizing them. It's not a great argument, but nonetheless, this is kind of what they're arguing. So you kind of get the idea, the image of what life was like in Africa, and they're saying, oh, they would just be, dumb, lazy, laying around Africa, but we gave them purpose. It's a complete fallacy, completely made up, but they liked saying it. Now, this one hits the nail on the head a little more closely. To maintain social order, there is a strict racial hierarchy in the South. So you have the planter elites. They had most of the money and most of the political power. Beneath them, you had small farmers. So these are middle-class white people. They might own one or two slaves if they're lucky, but most of the time it's just small farms. Then you have poor whites, also known as poor white trash, kind of in some of the literature. These are the people that have nothing. They often can't afford their own land. They're often working as sharecroppers or tenant farmers for other landowners. And they're about on the same level as freed blacks. And then slaves and freed blacks are at the very bottom. Now, what maintains control for the planter elites is these poor whites, even though they make up the vast portion of the population and could swing elections away from the planter elites, they always vote with the white planters, the white slave owners, because the white slave owners can always say, no matter how bad your life is as a poor white, at least you're not a slave. At least you have your freedom. You're better than black people. So this racial white supremacy is how they maintain social order, but the only way you can maintain white supremacy, at least in their mind during this period of slavery, is by the institution of slavery. Without slavery, you can't maintain this separation as easily. We'll find out that with Jim Crow and other rules, the laws that get passed later on, they recreate kind of a pseudo-slavery, at least in a social hierarchy. But nonetheless, this is a big deal. This is how the wealthy planters and slave owners maintain most of their power. Then you get this weird idea from a guy named James Henry Hammond. He comes up with something called the Sill Theory. Now he argues that all great Americans, great white Americans, were able to do great things because they were slave owners. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. He was able to write wonderful documents that founded the nation. George Washington was a slave owner. He was able to go fight the American Revolution and be president because he had slaves doing all the work. What he argues is slavery actually made America better by allowing white people to go do great things. Now, somehow he forgets all the white guys that didn't own slaves that still did great things, but nonetheless. So people like these ideas, anything that will support it. But when you're supporting slavery, the big problem is you're often cherry picking. You're choosing one little piece, one little example, one little anecdote to justify a very big, very bad institution. And it's not a great way to make an argument, but nonetheless, this is how the South did it. Now, these plantations are going to change the way Southern society works. This is a society based upon fear and based upon violence. And because of that, this is going to warp how the South reacts with the rest of the United States and the rest of the world. So you got to think about this. The whole Southern society is based on slavery. Everything is wrapped up in it. Even if you don't own slaves, you might be a sheriff or a deputy that has to enforce slavery. You might be the auctioneer selling the slaves. You might be the businessman, the merchant carrying the cotton from the plantation. So the whole Southern society is based around slavery, even if you yourself don't own slaves. So this is a very strange system, and it's one that keeps kind of reinforcing itself. So even if you don't agree with slavery and owning people, it's very hard to go against it in the South because your whole economic livelihood in your mind exists because of it. Now what's ironic is we'll find out after this end of the Civil War and the end of slavery, profits actually go up with the end of slavery. Curious, right? But nonetheless, we'll get more on that as we get to Reconstruction and next semester. So we're going to briefly look at slavery as an economic institution. Was slavery economically viable? So we have this economic division between North and South. You can kind of see on this map. In the South, very few factories, very few kind of textile mills. So the little black with two lines is the factories, a little what looks like a roll of cloth or textile mills. Very few in the South, massive amounts in the North. This is a problem. The South is growing almost exclusively cotton. They don't really differentiate their crops. There's a little bit of sugar around New Orleans area, Louisiana, but almost exclusively cotton. This means if cotton is making good money that year, you're going to get rich. If it has a low year, a bad paying year, the whole South is going to get hurt. Or if you have a plague that hits your crop or a drought, that's going to devastate not just your crop, but the entire Southern economy. So this is a very dangerous thing. Now, slavery was extremely profitable. Slaves themselves were extremely valuable commodities. So as you can see, kind of the cost of a slave as they got older, more and more valuable. So kind of around 18 And around 35 or so, you have kind of peaks of their value. And this is kind of, so 18, physical fitness, 35 up to like 50, you have skills. So you have skilled slaves that might have been taught a skill or just experience. So slaves are valuable, and basically slave owners have all of their wealth wrapped up in their slaves. While they own land, most of their wealth is actually in the slaves. So you don't really want to kill your slaves or treat them too badly for the most part, because that's your money. So slavery was actually a defense for the slaves in some cases. But as we'll talk about with the experience of slaves, it really depended on the master. So you might have a good master that, I mean, he was still a master, so how good is it? But he treats you fairly, gives you food, clothes, doesn't beat you, all this kind of stuff. And then you might have the worst master ever who beats you, rapes you, does terrible things. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, it is a very profitable institution. That's why they kept doing it. But as we will find out later on, it's actually going to be more profitable to get rid of slavery. But they don't believe that at the time. So let's look at some of the effects of slavery on the Southern economy. So a lack of economic diversity. So chattel property, so these are the slaves, are poor consumers. They don't have any money, they can't buy anything, therefore Southern society never develops a big production industry, in fact, manufacturing industry, because 4 million of their population, which is about a fifth of the population, won't buy anything because they can't, because they're slaves. You have this constant moral dilemma. We're owning people, we know it's bad, but we have to defend it. Kind of the slave defenses that we just talked about. And they kind of lose national leadership because they kind of lose the moral high ground, but they're also so focused inward on defending their own institution, the rest of the United States keeps moving forward and the South kind of stagnates, not just for the South, but for the whole world. They're kind of this archaic throwback by the time of the Civil War. Many European nations kind of look down on the South for their, not so much their racism, but their persistence of slavery. Because by this point, by the time of the Civil War, England has already outlawed slavery within their empire. And ultimately, all of this pursuit of violence, is going to ultimately result in the American Civil War. So we'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up with the next video on kind of the slave perspective.